What's happening, ladies and gents? So, subject of today is probably going to be a popular one. It's carbohydrates, and more specifically, the question I got on the forum was, why do some personal training companies or personal trainers take all of the carbohydrates out of the diet? Okay, now that's neither right nor wrong. It's individually dependent, and there are reasons for and against it. I'm going to explain them in this video a little bit. The first thing I want you to understand, and get a pen and write this down, is that you need carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are not the bad guy, bad girl. They are required in your diet, and it is very, very important that you do not fear them, because there is going to come a stage in your diet that you are going to require a lot of carbohydrates. That happens for everybody, and if you are fearing them, even if you get past this stage and you can get fat off you, which is down to calories, not carbs, there is going to come a stage where carbohydrates are vitally important to changing your body shape and optimizing your health and energy, etc., etc., etc. So carbs are not the devil. Our abuse of carbs is the devil. We'll go into that a little bit more. So carbohydrates, what are they? Carbohydrates are one of your three macronutrients, and a macronutrient is something that you need in large amounts. Micro being small, and these are our micronutrients, our vitamins, our minerals. Macro being large, this is our proteins, carbs, and fats. So just in the name of it, we know that your body requires a large amount of it in order to operate. So it is a macronutrient. We need a large amount of it. What does it do? Carbohydrates are converted into glucose, are converted into glycogen. It's our primary source of fuel, especially muscle fuel. So when you're moving around all day, your muscles are contracting, especially during weight training, we require a certain amount of carbohydrates. It's very, very important that we get those carbohydrates in. Our brain requires a lot of carbohydrates. Now, in the absence of dietary carbohydrates, what the body will do is break down muscle tissue in order to find it. Now, yes, it will break down fat for energy, but that's not an easy process for the body. It will also try to break down muscle tissue. So, if you are not taking in enough protein, dietary protein, if you're not taking in enough dietary carbs, then your body's going to be breaking down as much muscle as it does fat. We don't want that because potentially that's going to slow your metabolism down. It means getting lean, and staying lean is way, way harder. So if we can keep carbohydrates in the diet, we should use the food to feed and fuel us, as opposed to making the body catabolize and eat itself to provide that fuel. Okay, so we know what carbohydrates are. They are a macronutrient, meaning we need them in large amounts. Our carbohydrates, typically, we're going to interpret our carbohydrates as the fun stuff. So we know that bad carbohydrates are like the chocolates and the cakes and the sweet stuff and the sugars and the cereals, blah, blah, blah. But carbohydrates are also the less bad stuff, certainly not bad at all, in fact, but our more commonly known carbohydrates are starchy carbs. So starchy carbs being our bread, rice, yams, sweet potato, these types of things. Good carbs, very, very good carbs. We require them, just the right amounts. And we're also taking in complex carbohydrates, which are our more high fiber carbs. These are our vegetables, our fruits, things like that. So a lot of people assume that carbohydrates are probably just the first two. They assume that they are the sweet stuff we know we shouldn't have, and they're the other stuff that make up our diet, the grains and rices and pastas and breads that we think we shouldn't have. You can have them, it's absolutely fine. We forget that carbohydrates are also vegetables. They are also fruits. The difference is they're not quite so fun. They're much, much higher fiber. So, providing you're still taking in vegetables, you're still taking in carbs. If you're taking in fruit, you're taking in carbs, etc., etc., etc. So it's very rare that we can get super low carb. This is why things like keto, when people say, you know, getting into ketosis, this, that, and the other, it's actually really, really, really hard to get into ketosis, because there'll be carbs slipping in from all over the place, and your body needs those carbs. So, we now understand what carbohydrates are, where they come from. The reason that some personal trainers or some PT businesses, including, you know, the one I worked for, UP, I had 12 amazing years at UP, and one of UP's primary models to teach the trainers was to take away carbohydrates initially. Now, generally that is going to be around 10 days to 2 weeks, and I will tell you why. Again, get a pen and write this down. It's always supposed to be temporary, because trainers, including UP, including myself, any other, should know, and UP definitely do, that it is a temporary measure, because it can be a great time to increase motivation from a client. Now, when a client starts a diet, generally they're going to be at their most motivated, because a diet, the further you get into it, the harder it gets. The longer you're doing it, the harder it gets to some degree. Now, obviously, exponentially, in theory, if you're doing everything right, your results are better, you're getting closer to your end goal, so you should be slightly more motivated and be able to overcome it in theory. But if we were to say, right now, you've come to me and you're super, super, super desperate to lose weight, you've just put, thousands of euros down on one-to-one personal training, and I say, right, what I want you to do, we're going to take away all of these carbohydrates. Okay, you're just going to eat protein and vegetables for X amount of time. Now, generally, the smart thing to do would be to do that between 7 days and 2 weeks, let's say. What that does is, number one, and primarily, puts you in a calorie deficit. Puts you really, really, really simply into a calorie deficit. You don't have to mess about with anything else. You're eating your protein, your veg, and maybe a few pieces of fruit. You're in a calorie deficit. So that's the primary method of fat loss we look for. The second thing it does is it's going to help you lose loads of water weight. So the chances are, before you've started a personal training package, you're going to be carrying quite a lot of water because you maybe have been eating shit, maybe you've been eating too many carbs, maybe you've been eating processed food. You're carrying water weight. So by taking away carbohydrates, what that actually does, less glucose molecules in the muscle actually means it pulls in less water molecules. So for every glucose molecule you have in your body, you will pull in 4, it will attract 4 water molecules. So by taking away the glucose, the carbs, you also take away a load of water. So when you start a new diet, you lose a bit of fat, maybe half kilo in that 2 weeks, but you're probably going to lose 4, 5, 6 kilos of water, of fluid. So for most people on the scales, they're thinking, oh my God, this low carb approach, it's amazing, it's working epically. I've lost 5 kilos in 2 weeks, this is killer. The danger of that is that you then attach carbohydrates to weight loss, when maybe you've lost just a little bit of fat, but loads and loads of water. If you'd have just maybe put the calorie deficit in, you'd have lost exactly the same amount of fat, but not so much water, meaning that maybe you wouldn't be quite so motivated to continue the diet because you'd only lost a kilo versus 6, okay? So it's a good tool there because the client thinks that the water loss is weight loss and it can put you into a hyper-motivated state. So very easy to do. What carbohydrates would always do, or removing carbohydrates, is going to help to bring down inflammation, especially if that inflammation is driven by insulin, which for very many people it is. So removing carbohydrates is going to bring down inflammation. When you bring down inflammation, you feel a lot better. You're going to look a lot better. The fat is going to start to mobilize a little bit easier. Again, less inflammation, less weight. Visually, you will change. It's not fat, it's just inflammation. So there are purposes to it. Now, if we were to say those are kind of the big pros about it, all of that stuff can potentially happen in a couple of weeks. From there, you want to start integrating carbohydrates because the downsides of taking carbohydrates away. Number one, let's take the most obvious one. If you take carbohydrates away for too long, you start craving carbohydrates. That's usually because you're in too big a calorie deficit and eventually your body says, I know I need glucose. I know I need it. It's a macronutrient. I need it in X amount. I need it to fuel my brain. I need it to fuel my muscles. I'm weight training as well. I'm doing all these training sessions. I'm working hard. My body needs carbohydrates. So eventually it will start to signal to you. It will say, give me some carbs. Give me some carbs. And guess what? Your body doesn't turn around and say, I want carbs from broccoli or I want carbs from oats. It says, give me carbohydrates in the fastest possible way to fix the problem you are causing me. You've taken away all of my carbohydrates for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, whatever. I want something. Give me something because I'm in trouble now. And it won't say broccoli or oats. It'll say cake, chocolate, pizza, blah, blah, blah. It knows you've taught it over 30, 40, 50 years, however old you may be. You have taught it by putting things in your mouth where it can get a fix of carbohydrates, where it can get a fix of fats quickly. And it will then crave those things in order to solve the problem as fast as possible. Okay, so you'll reach for bad food. That's the first downside of taking away all of your carbohydrates in your diet. Eventually you're going to start to crave and you will cheat. The second thing is that you want some level of insulin circulating around your body, and we can manipulate that at different times because insulin and your stress hormone cortisol have an inverse relationship. So when cortisol is high, insulin can help push it down. So if we have a dose of carbohydrates, it can help keep our stress hormones nice and low. And we don't want our stress hormones chronically high because it affects our testosterone, it's going to affect our sex drive, it's going to affect our ability to burn fat, it's going to affect our ability to burn muscle, it's going to affect our mood, which in turn could affect our work, could affect our productivity. So we want to be able to control our stress hormones as well, and carbohydrates help us to do that. Carbohydrates are also stimulatory to the thyroid. The thyroid needs glucose to operate optimally. So if you're not giving it enough, it will start to get negatively affected as well, which we do not want. It's going to affect your training by not taking in enough carbohydrates to, at the very least, refuel your muscle for your weight training sessions. You're going to train suboptimally. So yeah, again, maybe you take away X amount of carbohydrates. Let's say I take away 400 calories of carbohydrates in my day, but because of that, I burn 400 calories less in my workout. Whereas it would have been easier to have the extra 400 calories of carbohydrates and have a sick workout, still be full of energy, then go do a 200 calorie walk. One of them leaves you in exactly the same place because you took too much away and therefore you had less activity, versus one where you added a little bit more food, yes, but you had so much energy that you actually burned yourself an extra 200 calories. Okay, so it's a lesser of two evils sometimes. So there are pros and cons to both sides of it. There are social cons in that take them away. Maybe you're not going to be able to go out and have dinner with your wife or your partner or your husband or your kids or blah, 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 blah. There are many, many reasons why we should try to keep some carbohydrates in the diet. Now, can that first 2-week period be handy? Yes, it can. Brings down water weight, will bring down some fat. It's potentially going to bring down inflammation. And if you have a particularly overweight client, someone who's carrying a lot of fat, you can help to improve insulin sensitivity that way. And insulin, again, remember, is if you are taking in way too many carbohydrates too often, all of the time, that can make you insulin resistant because your body becomes desensitized to the release of insulin. Insulin ends up flooding around the body constantly. We have an issue at that stage. Taking away all the carbohydrates will empty everything out of the muscle cell. In theory, will allow that muscle cell to open up to allow glycogen to go back in. So it can make you more insulin sensitive. That can be useful for extremely overweight clients. But again, no more useful than a carb-controlled diet with someone who is weight training. Carbohydrates are not necessarily the answer to fat loss. Now, what is the answer with carbohydrates? The first thing we need to look at is the total amount that you're taking in during the day. Now, most people can take in way more carbohydrates than they think. The difference is that they need to take in the right type of carbohydrates. That's the first point. Second thing is when they take in those carbohydrates. And the third thing is portion control with those carbohydrates. So, the overall quantity is going to be dependent on a lot of things. To some degree, some people are just going to be more predetermined to be able to handle carbohydrates. So that's point one. Some people can have way more, some people need way less. Point two is how much muscle tissue you have. If you have a lot of muscle tissue, if you're big and strong, even if you're fat, you can handle a lot more carbohydrates than most people. Whereas if you're, if you're a guy and you're only 45 kilos and you've got muscles like knots in a midgie's cock, you've got nothing there, then you're not going to be able to handle many carbohydrates. Okay, so a lot of it is down to muscle. Again, if we talk about the total amounts, if you are leaner, chances are you're more insulin sensitive, you can handle carbohydrates better because you've looked after that. Then again, you can have more. The amount is going to be down to the individual. There is no answer to that, but everybody needs carbohydrates, so swiping them all out is not the answer long term. Second part of that was portion control. One of the problems people have with carbs is they take in way too many per meal. You're way, way better off having a bunch of smaller portions of carbohydrates across your day when you're in a high carb diet or you're taking in carbohydrates, because that's going to prevent any massive insulin spikes, it's going to keep your blood sugar stable, it's going to help to prevent any kind of excess or spillover. Whereas what most people will do is instead of spreading out little portions of carbohydrates across their day, maybe they have 3 meals in a day. And across those 3 meals, they're having 250 to 300 grams of carbohydrates. And that would be, when I'm having a bowl of pasta, I'm having a big bowl of pasta. When I'm having my dinner, maybe I'm having chips or a big dollop of mashed potato or blah, 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 blah. So on each plate, I've got 120, 130, 150 grams of carbohydrates per plate. The body can probably, again, dependent on the person, handle between 30 and 50 grams of carbohydrate at any given time. Okay? So if we're spreading that out, adding 30 to 50 grams across a day, in these little servings, we never really get massive insulin issues. Whereas if we're eating 3 times a day and we're having our massive carb portions, yeah, maybe our body can handle 30, 50 grams of it at a push, but the rest of it, your body's like, shit, I need to do something with this. I've got loads of sugar flowing around my blood, releases insulin, gets rid of it, goes and stores it as fat, potentially stores it as fat, depends on your calorie status. So we want to manage the portions as well as the total amount. Then, of course, we've got training added into that. When you train, you require more carbohydrates. When you weight train specifically, it's not quite the same for things like cardio, because steady state cardio doesn't really burn away much glucose. It burns away about the same amount of fat hour for hour, but it doesn't burn away carbohydrates as well. So if you're not weight training, you require less carbohydrates. You could do better off with a higher fat diet that way. Okay? So there are a bunch of reasons why you are going to need carbohydrates. There are pros and cons to a short-term no-carb diet, but ultimately everybody is different. Some people, yes, without any shadow of a doubt, operate way better on a lower carb diet, but it is important to understand, and I say this all of the time, low carb versus no carb are two very different things. Very, very different things. Now, what I would consider low carb, and about as low as you really need to go, yes, you can go lower for sure, but you don't really need to. There's no added benefit to it, would be probably between 1 and 1.5 grams per kilo of body weight. So let's say you're 100 kilos. Your low carb diet should probably be somewhere around 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrates a day. Now that's going to include your fruit, your vegetables, and your starchy carbohydrates, and you'll do well to split them up into small portions. Okay, no carbing it, i.e. eating chicken and broccoli and a few nuts for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 12 weeks, 8 weeks, 16 weeks at a time is not a smart idea. It just isn't. Now, I can tell you this. For some of you know my history, some of you maybe do not. I was obese my whole life. When I decided to lose fat, I took the low carb approach. I basically starved myself of carbohydrates for years. And I was militant with it. Militant. Absolutely horrendous with it. Now, did it get me lean? Yes, it did. It got me very, very lean. Did it get me lean because I reduced carbohydrates? No. It got me lean because I reduced calories through carbohydrates. I was eating next to nothing. I was training 3 times a day. The issue that has left me with, by the time I got lean, I had destroyed my testosterone output. I've been on medication for my testosterone since I was 21 years old. Now, that has come from how I dieted back in those days. Okay, it was a silly thing to do. My thyroid is completely and utterly shut down from dieting too low and dieting 0 carb. It's gone, it's non-existent. Again, I'm medicated for that at a low level as well. Now, what this has left me with personally is massive problems with maintaining my body composition. If I stop and I relax, if I'm not militant with my diet, my body just barrels on fat because my metabolic output is so low, my testosterone is so low. This is as a result of me going too extreme with my diets, and this is why I try to advocate to all of you, don't do it, because a short-term fix leads to long-term problems. This is a fact. So, in summary, low-carb diets or zero-carb diets, those zero-carb starts to diets, can they be useful? Yes, they can. You do not need to do them really for more than a couple of weeks. The benefits to them are insulin sensitivity, potentially, massive reduction in inflammation, a reduction in water weight, which can be extremely motivating. That's kind of a mindset hit for you. There are also cons to them, and they shouldn't be sustained for too long. That's all I'm saying. And again, most of these trainers who do it, they're not going to put you on zero carb for too long. But it is also important to remember carbohydrates are also coming from your fruits, from your vegetables, all these types of things. Okay? You don't need to do it. If you wish to take the low carb approach, for example, the low carb approach on the app is about 15% of your calories come from carbohydrates. Okay, so if you're on 1,000 calories, you're going to be getting about 150. Obviously, you're not going to be on 1,000 calories because we don't allow the plan to go that low. You're going to be on about 150 grams of carbohydrates. Okay, and that was what I would consider low carb. That's a low carb diet. Okay, 2,000 calories, you're going to be anything up to about 300 grams of carbs. Again, if you're on 2,000 calories, it's going to fluctuate because we have a variance there. But generally, you want to be taking carbohydrates, spreading them out through your day. There is no right or wrong to that low carb boot camp approach, but it should only ever be short term. And I've explained to you the reason it is used. It is not some magic pill for fat loss. And it's really important that you get that into your head, because if you learn to fear carbohydrates, your problems further down the line, and I've been doing this for 16, 17 years, I've watched this happen, I've given this lecture to many, many people, the problems further down the line will come. They will come, and they are far harder to overcome than you accepting eating carbohydrates now. Your fat loss is going to be down to your overall calorie and hormonal status. If we are eating enough of the right foods, we're keeping our stress hormones low, we're recovering well, we're training hard, fat will come off. It is simple laws of thermodynamics. Fat will come off if you can put yourself in a small enough, manageable calorie deficit and do it consistently. Very simple. Carbs are not the devil. The misuse of carbs is the devil.